Okay, good evening and welcome, and thank you for giving up a chunk of your lives to hear about what I think are really some very important questions. Those of you who've been before will know that the Marshall Institute at LSE was set up in part to think hard about philanthropy, to put some science and some theory and some teaching around this extraordinary phenomenon whereby humans support each other with money and with time and with energy and with what we are increasingly calling altruistic capital. And if you care about philanthropy, you have to care about faith, since, as I think we will hear this evening, faith groups are responsible for very significant commitments as foundational commitments to ideas of human support and giving. And we're very lucky to have three representatives of different positions here to share their expertise with us. The evening's going to take the form of very short statements from our three guests, followed by some equally short questions from me for those guests, followed by, I hope, equally short questions from you to them. We have until 8 o'clock, when we will finish promptly. And all I want to do before I ask each of them to speak is to introduce them very briefly. I think you've read their biographies. On the far left, I think positionally, though it's up to him to tell us whether that's also true politically, is my friend and colleague. I call him Jim, James Walters, who's a member of the Marshall Institute and the chaplain at LSE. He is, and he will hate me for this, also the author of this newly published book, which I strongly recommend that you purchase. Whether you read it or not is up to you, but I strongly recommend you purchase it. And Jim, of course, is going to speak for the, I don't know the number, 2 billion-ish Christians in the world who routinely give. Okay? Rather extraordinary number if 2 billion is about right. In the centre, and again I make no political inference, is Shoshana Boyd Gelfand, who runs the Pears Foundation here in London. I don't have it to show you, but it turns out that she is the author of the Barefoot Book of Jewish Tales. And she is, which I strongly recommend you buy. She's going to talk to us a little bit, I think, about the Jewish principle, kind of ethical principle of tzedakah. Close.
We were practicing before.
Yeah, I got it wrong again, didn't I?
But you got the beginning right, though,
okay.
which is commendable.
Say it so that they hear the right expression. Tzedakah, I beg your pardon. Which is the Jewish principle of giving. And then finally, my closest neighbor is Iqbal Nasim, who runs the National Zakat Foundation. And some of you will know that Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam and a strong commitment to giving. So you can see why we've assembled this grouping. I'm going to ask each of my friends to, as it were, speak briefly to the core position of their faith and to this question about private giving for public benefit. And I'm going to start by asking Iqbal to tell us that story.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm not sure I've managed a very short introduction to anything before, or a brief statement, but I will do my best. There's a first time for everything. And I was hoping that we were going to go in chronological order of religion, but maybe in one sense we are, because of course Muslims understand Islam as simply as submission or subservience, commitment to God, as in some senses like a meta sort of religion. The function of the Prophet Muhammad was a restorative one, to continue the message, the fundamental message of Abraham, or Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, etc. To introduce this idea, I'm going to actually refer to a very similar topic, and this will, or notion, the notion of sadaqah, right? Zadaqah maybe in the Hebrew, that was probably a very bad pronunciation, but in the Arabic there is sadaqah, there is also a very similar notion. So I want to ask you to do something, because it will help us get into the, hopefully into the mood of this and understand the notion well, and hopefully embed it in our minds. It's simply to look at the person next to you and smile. Just smile. That's it, there you go. You have all practiced, there you go. You've all practiced sadaqah. This is private action for public benefit, right? We've all practiced the notion of sadaqah, because even to smile is a form of sadaqah. And the idea of sadaqah is, linguistically, it means sidq, it means truthfulness, right? It is, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, Muhammad, he said that a sadaqatu burhan, which means that a sadaqah is a proof of one's faith. The idea is that embedded in the connection or the belief in one God and in our accountability before Him, and as Muslims believe in a hereafter, embedded in that idea, and based on the fact that He loves us and we are committed to Him, we have embedded in our belief system the moral and even legal responsibility to give, to support, to be of service to others. And this idea of smiling as a form of charity or philanthropy, sadaqah, was actually mentioned in one context in one of the prophetic narrations as in response to a complaint by one of the companions of the Prophet that all the rich people have gone off with all of the benefit. Because they pray like we pray, they fast like we fast, but they also have wealth and they give, but we don't have it. We can't do it in the same way. Then he would encourage, and in that narration and many different ones, the idea of different forms of sadaqah. Enjoining good, or forbidding, preventing injustice or wrongdoing is a form of sadaqah. To remove something harmful from the road, to help someone, to just facilitate, basically, to facilitate. Anything that makes things easier, lightens the mood, brings hope, brings a sense of optimism. All of this is in this idea of sadaqah. Since I run the National Zakat Foundation, I should obviously give a contrast, if you like, the idea of zakat with the idea of sadaqah. Because zakat is in effect the starting point, as was mentioned by Stefan. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Of course, you all know the other 4. And the first one is the shahada, okay, which is the testimony of faith, just to declare the oneness of God and the finality of the prophethood of Muhammad and the fact that he's the final messenger. The salah, which is the 5 times daily prayers. The zakah, which is the obligatory act of giving. The psalm, which is fasting, and then the hajj, which is a pilgrimage. And those first 3, the testimony of faith, bearing witness to God, not just as a verbal declaration, but with our whole being, if you like. And then salah and zakah, the prayer and the act of giving. These 3 are actually, from a Quranic narrative, at the very center of, or the DNA of even the previous traditions. So these things are mentioned in the Quran in the context of Jesus and Moses and Abraham and others. The idea is that we test the minimum that a believer does is testify and try to bear witness to God in all of their interactions, privately and publicly. Maintain that prayer as a way of maintaining that connection and reminding yourself of who you are, and then giving. So zakat actually, in a normative sense, is actually not as much a private action as it is a public affair, public resource. It's a wealth tax, right? You pay 2.5% once every year for those who cross a certain minimum sort of threshold of wealth, 2.5% of what you have. And in principle, that's supposed to be then administered by some sort of authority or body within the polity, within the community. Now, in Muslim minority communities, that typically has not been the case. So in a way, practically how Muslims have gone about doing zakah has been very much like doing charity, right? So it has almost become an act of charity, and so it's up to the personal conscience of the person as to whether they will then calculate and pay. What we're trying to do at the National Zakat Foundation is to try to bring some order to that. So zakat is supposed to be the part where there's some sort of order to it, and then the sadaqah part is the voluntary kind of action. So that's in terms of just the basic kind of concepts and principles. I think I'll just say one last thing, which is to do with when we talk about private action. In a sense, there is no, I was thinking about this idea of, which is at the heart of the Marshall Institute, private action for public benefit. There is no private action, as far as we're concerned, that doesn't have a public benefit, even if that private action doesn't involve anybody else. Because even prayer, which is, it's encouraged, for example, that we do prayer together, but let's say prayer which is done completely privately and personally, even that is deemed to have a public benefit because of what it should do to cultivate, to develop a sense of God consciousness in a person, which then is supposed to have an effect in how they behave in society. So actually, before we bring good through the money and the positive action that we do in society, actually there's this idea of at least not being a nuisance, at least not being a source of harm. So in the Quran it mentions Inna salata tanha anil fahsha wal munkar, which means prayer actually is a preventer of immorality and wrongdoing. So there is a kind of private action and a private public action, if you like. Public benefit, of course, we'll discuss that later on. I will stop there because I'm trying to achieve that sort of first time of speaking briefly. But the public benefit part and what exactly that means from a Muslim perspective and the levels of that, hopefully, inshallah, God willing, as we say, we'll address later on. Thank you.
We'll come back to you for the public benefit piece.
Sure.
Shoshana, same brief.
Well, I hope I can do that as well as you just did. I actually want to try and do this. The title is Faith and Philanthropy, Is Religion a Force for Good? And both of those words are problematic for me, faith and philanthropy. So let me just go into each one of those. Judaism isn't a faith, or it's not simply a faith. In fact, no one before 250 years ago would have described it as a faith. It just that is an enlightenment concept that Judaism has fit into. So if I am talking about Judaism, I'm talking about an ethnic group. I'm talking about a culture. I'm talking about a people. The way you become Jewish is you're either born into it or you convert into it, which means that you can be a Jewish atheist. Now, if you can be a Jewish atheist, Judaism is not a faith. So I want to put it out there that when I'm talking about Judaism, it may have nothing to do with God. It may have everything to do with God. It depends on which Jew you're talking to. And I would say, always check with your Jew. That being said, Judaism has a strong tradition of giving tzedakah, and that's where I want to get into philanthropy. We don't have a tradition of philanthropy. We don't have a tradition of charity. And the reason I'm being pedantic here is that these are language is important, and I want to try and unpack what the concept is in Judaism without having to fit it into a category that is very much a Greek category. Right? So caritas, charity, is something you do from your heart. Tzedakah is not. Is it nice if you're kind and good and want to give? Yes, absolutely. That is to be commended, and that's sort of a higher level of tzedakah. But tzedakah is a requirement. It comes from the Hebrew root tzedek, which means justice. So it is at the core of social justice to give tzedakah, which, if you're going back to biblical times, would have emerged out of the tithing system. You didn't have a choice whether you wanted to tithe or not. This was a requirement. This was how a just society would function. And perhaps it's become such a embedded part of Jewish tradition. Notice I didn't say Jewish faith, of Jewish tradition, that I don't have statistics worldwide, but we do have statistics in the UK that 93% of those of Jews give financially. That's compared to 57% in the general public. So there is, and we also know in the UK that the more religious you are, the more orthodox you are, the increase in the giving. So there is something there of the more people are embedded in this idea of their tradition, and the tradition had tzedakah at its core, somehow that translates into a behavior of giving financially. But I'm fascinated by what you're saying, Iqbal, because we also have another concept, which is called chesed. And that is absolutely not financial giving. So financial giving, there's a requirement to do it, there's a formula. We don't have a centralized way of doing it, but one of the ways I manifest this in my own practice, I have a CAF account, right? So that money, that percentage, I put into the CAF account because it's not mine, right? It just gets lopped off and put into that account.
Tell them Charity Aid
The Charities Aid Foundation. So it's a way of basically, if you take £100 and put it into the Charities Aid Foundation, it's like me having my own little Shoshana foundation, right? I've set it up, it's a legal entity, and the money is no longer mine. The money must be given to a charitable cause. But I can then choose to give it out of that pot of money. So that's my way of just making sure that I fulfill that requirement of tzedakah, to just lop the money off, put it into a separate bank account where it no longer belongs to me, and then I get to decide. One of my favorite things to do to give a young person a gift is to write them a CAF check from that account and to leave the payee blank and to write them a note and say, you need to fill in who this is going to, right? And it can only be cashed by a charity, right? So that's sort of my own. I don't have a lot of money, okay, but this is I'll give small amounts of money to someone on their birthday in order to help inculcate this Jewish notion of giving. But there's another concept called chesed. Chesed are those non-monetary types of giving, which Jewish tradition says they just can't be measured. Visiting the sick, working in a soup kitchen, to feed the hungry. These are things that you must do with your heart and your soul, and cannot really be required, in the sense of that work is never finished. So both of these are things that are concepts that we're supposed to do, but I think the language is important. Chesed comes from the root for kindness. Tzedakah comes from the root for justice. And I'm not sure whether Jewish tradition would have come up with a notion of philanthropy, which actually has both of those concepts put together. That being said, I think most of the philanthropy that's done falls into the category of tzedakah. So now that I've clarified my terms, I think at least we can have a conversation.
Thank you.
Jim?
Please. Okay, so to speak about private action is to talk about the individual, and I think Christianity has a strong sense of the individual as both the locus of redemption and therefore the origin of moral responsibility. The individual in the Christian faith is the recipient of the gift of what God has done in Jesus Christ. That's the essence, that's at the heart of the gospel. So if moral action begins with the question, what does the individual owe to God? In the Christian tradition, there is a paradox. Because on the one hand, the answer to that is absolutely nothing at all. And St. Paul in particular is very clear that redemption is a gift, and anything that we do, any works of righteousness, are of no consequence in terms of salvation, in salvific terms. But on the other hand, the answer to that question, of course, is everything. And Jesus in Luke's Gospel says quite clearly, if anyone will be my disciple, he must give up everything, all his possessions, he says. It's funny how a lot of biblical literalists sort of forget that verse or sort of ignore it. This paradox is summed up rather beautifully, I think, in Christina Rossetti's poem, which we sing at Christmas, in the bleak midwinter. And the last verse, some of you may recall, asks, "What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would give a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what I give him, give my heart." So to give your heart, and this is the caritas that Shoshana alluded to, it's not to adopt any particular practices or make specified sacrifices, but it is to give everything. It is to live your entire life and use everything at your disposal for God's glory. Paul, therefore, given his nervousness about works, he understands acts of giving as precisely a participation in what God has done. And if we look at his appeal to the church in Corinth to help the poorer Christians in Jerusalem, he phrases it in precisely these terms. He says, this is not a command. I'm not telling you to do this, but if you really reflect on what Jesus has done for you, then you will want to participate in this, and you will want to show the generosity that God has shown you to those who are in need. So he's saying faith doesn't lead faith doesn't require works, but faith leads to generosity. So there are some systemic ways of thinking about giving in the Christian tradition. Stewardship, we often call it in church. And many churches teach, I'm certainly brought up with the practice of tithing that comes from the Hebrew scriptures. But there's also a tradition that wants to resist that sort of systematization or codification of moral responsibility. And so there's this paradox of free but dutiful giving. And you see this especially in some of the preaching of John Wesley, who has this now rather famous phrase, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And that's obviously open to huge misinterpretation. But it seems to me that the key word in that sentence is you. Reflect on what response you want to make to the generosity of God, and do it with vigour and conviction. So then coming to the Christian benefit to which, the public benefit to which that private action goes, the Christian term, I was thinking about this, for public benefit, is really the kingdom of God. When Christians pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, in the Lord's Prayer, they're praying for the coming of the kingdom of God that Jesus heralded, and they're really praying that aspects of God's ultimate purposes for creation can be sort of realized now, that we can be part of making that happen. And similarly, I suppose, to giving, the kingdom of God isn't a system. There is no manifesto. It's not a social blueprint of any kind. And it's often described by Jesus enigmatically in terms of stories, in parables. Many of those parables are about things that are lost, the lost sheep, the lost coin. And then in the parable of the judgment of the nations, the separation of the sheep and the goats, Jesus identifies himself with people who are in some sense lost, the sick, the imprisoned, the hungry. And in the Christian understanding, showing compassion and putting our money where our mouth is with regard to these people is very solidly of public benefit because of the Christian understanding, yes, of the centrality of the individual, but the interconnectedness of the individual within the body politic. And this is a big theme that St. Paul develops. He talks about society, about humanity as a human body that is interconnected, and that you can't say to one member of the body, I'm separate from you, I have no need of you. We're all connected. And that's actually an idea he takes from Greek thought, but the distinctive spin he gives on it is to say that the body needs to be reordered for the sake of the weaker members. So Stefan introduced me as being on the far left here. I hope it's not too far left a thing to say that I think the Christian understanding of the purpose of philanthropy and public benefit is not just to give money to kind of perpetuate things as they are now, but to reorder the system, the structures of the body politic for the sake of the lost.
Thank you. Before we get on to questions, I want to come, as it were, back down the line, just to ask each of you both to reflect very briefly on the public benefit piece of the conversation, then I'll start asking you questions.
Oh, there's so many ways to do that. I think I want to riff off of what Jim said? Because you were just making me think about that biblical concept of the sabbatical year, when actually you sort of have 6 years and then the land has to lie fallow. And then you've got the Jubilee year where 49 years, so 7 times 7, actually everything goes back to it's almost like one of those Harry Potter moments, that if you've sold yourself into slavery because you've had a financial mishap, or if you had to give your land away to a different tribe, the Jubilee year everything reverts back to its original owner. And I don't think you can get more public than that in terms of wealth redistribution. So what you've got woven into the fabric of sort of biblical economics and theology, and that's what's interesting, it's both, is a sense of capitalism for 6 years and then socialism for a year. And there's a polarity between them. This sense of to work and to make money and to generate wealth is a good thing. You're paying your tithes out of it that whole time, but then don't get too cocky about this, because that might be for your private benefit, but it's all going to then go back to a reminder that none of this actually belongs to you. So don't get cocky about that. And number two, we're going to have an economic redistribution of wealth. So I think public benefit, it's, I can't really make that distinction, because fundamentally what you're saying when you're doing tzedakah or you're doing this kind of wealth redistribution is an acknowledgement that none of this belongs to me. All the earth is God's, and for a little while, I get to look after this piece of land, or I get to have this money in my bank account, but actually it's not mine. And in biblical Hebrew, there's actually no way to say mine. Again, the language tells you the values underneath it. So the collective is the only way to think about something. There is no private action, so to speak. There's private responsibility, and then for the collective good.
I think the Muslim idea of public benefit is quite aligned to really what Jim was talking about as well. We're thinking on, I'll maybe phrase it in a different way, because we're thinking on two planes at once, right? Muslims are about, we're thinking of this life and the next. The first prayer that comes in the Quranic narrative is, our Lord, give us goodness in this life and in the hereafter. So if it's good for me to believe, to have faith, and then to do all the things associated with that, to recognize God and be in that relationship with Him. And then, as a result of the mercy that comes, and in some ways correlated with the actions that I've done, I then gain an eternal kind of presence with Him in paradise. And if that's deemed to be a good thing, then that's something which, again, at the heart of our, if you like, obligation actually to society is to at least present that as an option or an opportunity. And so there's a correlation between the money that is given, and then almost you're going up in sort of Maslow's hierarchy, in effect, right? So within the Zakat system, you've got the idea of, yes, dealing with the poor, the needy, the administrators of Zakat, using Zakat to actually bring hearts together so inter-community kind of relations. The emancipation is for the emancipation of slaves at that time, and then in contemporary senses to kind of, I suppose, remove social legal barriers that are preventing people from fulfilling their human potential. But then there's also the idea of investing in what's called sabilillah, the way of God, right? So how are we using also finances, not just to ameliorate people's material conditions, but also to deal with things that are beneath the surface. And I was just observing with Jim just before we started that it's interesting that the LSE is hosting this sort of seminar, a set of seminars this week called New World Disorders. I actually attended one yesterday. It was about, are we heading for a sort of digital dystopia? There was one, I think, last week as an introductory sort of thing, which was talking about the state of pessimism and why, even though everything materially is actually going in the right direction, and books are being written to remind people actually things are not that bad. But why are we also much more pessimistic? Down, actually quite, we depend a lot on Prozac at the moment. It's a Prozac nation, all of that stuff, right? So there's depression is high, pessimism is high, all of the things. So we believe that believers, presumably all of them, but everyone can speak for themselves, right? Well, we hold it that at the heart of what was going to solve our problems is a kind of a realignment or reconnection with an understanding of who we are as human beings. And just interestingly, just to finish off, the idea of good deeds, the word that's used for good deeds in Arabic, the amal salih, the sort of righteous or virtuous deeds, again, linguistically, is this idea of, that which restores and brings kind of a wholesome, is wholesome and brings kind of a wholeness to things. It's paired constantly with belief. So, indeed, those who believe and do righteous deeds. Indeed, those who believe and do righteous deeds, absolutely everywhere. The opposite of that is fasad. Okay, the opposite of that is corruption, disorder. And interestingly, in the Quran, there's a verse which says that the corruption spreads in the land and the sea because of what people have done, and that so that God can let them experience or taste the results of their actions, so that they might return. So that so it's almost as if some of the negative effects of a kind of the injustice and the wrongdoing that takes place, that is, in our view, correlated over time with a godlessness. Frankly, whether you call yourself a believer or not. So it's not about the label. It's about, is there God consciousness in the action, regardless of what you call yourself. Then actually the negative effects of that are in some ways a blessing in this life, because they kind of get us to think about our situation, look at it and think, well, maybe we need to recalibrate over here. And that would be the highest benefit that we could possibly bring to people in our view.
Thank you. Each of you has mentioned, either in passing or very specifically, something to do with public benefit as it benefits us, either in the coming of the kingdom, or in the opening of the prayer that you discussed, or in the absence in biblical Hebrew of the first-person version. And I just wondered on this pushing this idea of public benefit, whether the benefit is us meaning our tradition, our faith, our belief, or us meaning anyone outside that tradition or faith, or both, or some more nuanced version of my question.
It's a very good question. And it's one that's quite difficult to answer, I think, with statistics. I mean, we know, for example, that 77% of philanthropic giving in America is given to houses of worship and religious-based organizations. And, one might look at that and say, well, why aren't they giving to outside of their tradition and so forth? And yet, of course, a lot of those places of worship and religious organizations aren't limiting the service that they're providing to people within their tradition. If you go to any food bank run by the Church of England in this country, no one's going to say, well, are you a Christian? They're not interested. So with homeless shelters and so forth. So I think that this is the danger with faith-based social enterprise and all these kind of initiatives, that some kind of either discrimination comes in or some kind of catch, will help you if you give your life to Jesus. That can happen. But it needn't happen, and it doesn't happen all the time.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's, we have, I do a lot of work with Pears Foundation in international development, and there's this, I'm always thinking about, and we're very open and proud that we are a Jewish family foundation, and we share that openly. And I want to make sure that the people who we're working with, we do a lot of work in Rwanda and in Ghana in particular, don't somehow feel like, I want them to know where it's coming from. It's coming from a place of Jewish values and Jewish identity, but without any strings attached. And we have zero interest in anyone converting to Judaism or, somehow there's no agenda there. And that's a very difficult line to walk, particularly because historically, I don't think people have walked that line very well. And there have been all sorts of strings attached. So it's something I'm very conscious of. I'm going to quote Sir Trevor Pears, because when you ask him how much of Pears Foundation's funding goes to non-Jewish causes, because we say we're a Jewish family foundation, he says every penny. And then some people, this is like, you can always tell, because some people look at him and go, but I thought you guys do a lot of work to support autism and scouts and guides and Duke of Edinburgh. And that. He goes, yes. And then there's a long pause as this penny starts to sink for them that those are Jewish causes, right? That parochial Jewish causes are not the only kinds of Jewish causes. That one, as a Jew, needs to support one's, the education and building the identity of one's family, so to speak. And then one also has an obligation to the larger community that one is part of. And so one of the things that I really admire about him is that he lives very, very easily with his British identity and his Jewish identity, and he considers both of those to be Jewish causes, which is why he'll say every penny comes from a place of my Jewish identity. That doesn't necessarily mean that the recipient is going to be of my particular identity. In fact, obviously they're not, because I also have a human identity.
Interesting answer.
I mean, absolutely, Islam presents itself as an utterly universal proposition. So it almost necessarily makes everything in it is for the benefit of humanity. So a number of verses in the Quran and prophetic statements come to mind. We didn't send you, Muhammad, except as a mercy for all people. Obviously, the contemporary sort of media representations of Islam Muslims might not give us that impression, but that's what the Quranic narrative is. None of you truly believes until you love for others what you love for yourself. Muslim commentators agreed. What this means is all people, not just other Muslims. There is a reward for kindness that is exhibited or shown to any living thing. I mean, forget human beings for a second. Even if you look at the whole kind of mandate to be respectful towards the environment, animal welfare, all of these things as well. So, a very sort of universal idea. However, having said that, it is true that, for example, with the zakat specifically, that's very much considered as a starting point, almost like in our context, the way I like to describe it is almost as a membership fee. Because in principle, it's like a wealth tax, right? It's often practiced or thought of like charity because, as I said earlier, it's not really organized properly oftentimes. But the way I like to think about it is it's like a membership fee for a club, right? As a Muslim, you necessarily pay it as a member of Club Islam. Well, in the first instance, just like if you pay a membership fee for your local gym, you expect that those resources in the first instance are going to be used for your benefit, right? But the funds would also be used for the benefit of the members, supporting the members, because actually, and this just relates to, just to give an example of actually of maybe a distinction between kind of a secular view of philanthropy and a religious view of philanthropy, would be that when a Muslim gives zakat, and that zakat is used, for example, to help a poor Muslim, the other than, for example, the reward attained and the obligation fulfilled and all the rest of it, the kind of purpose, the deeper purpose of doing so is so that this person's poverty doesn't become a source of despair, a dislocation from the community, and eventually disbelief in God altogether. That's actually the kind of key point. It's not just out of purely an empathy, just comes from, they're in a really bad condition, I'm not, and so I give, and that's it. We've just dealt with the material only. So there's something a bit deeper. However, having said that, if you're like club members, are absolutely encouraged to go out there and help anyone and everyone in any way possible. There is no, there's a prophetic encouragement not to despise or belittle even the smallest of deeds. There are narrations about individuals who found favor with God and entry into paradise because of what they did for a thirsty dog, right? Even a prostitute who fed a prostitute is mentioned in a narration who made sure that a hungry cat was fed, and as a result of this, she was forgiven for what appeared to be obviously a major transgression, and achieved God's favor in that way. And so there's this idea also that it's very when we talk about philanthropy in a secular sense, we're often deceived by, or everything's about the numbers, and everything is about kind of worldly optimizing of this, that, and the other. Whereas obviously we're operating in different planes now. So what matters when the believer gives, the intention is critical. So there's a famous statement of one of the early kind of Muslim scholars who said that big actions can be rendered small by their intention, small actions can be rendered great by their intention. So it's actually, we need, the fact that one is doing it for, and the idea of, giving with one's right hand such that the left hand doesn't know. So there's a real sort of sense that this is first and foremost built, it's based on this kind of connection, vertical connection before it's on horizontal ones.
So I want to push this interaction between what you call secular philanthropy, you call, as it were, the kind of Greek origin of the very word and idea of a love of humanity. It's kind of the opposite of a love of let's call it God. I wonder whether you think that this thing called secular philanthropy or the modern scientific system of giving is lapsed in some way, has lost something, and what do you think the interactions are between that human-centered, often science and measurement and, in your words, numbers-based, whether there are things that system should be learning from your positions and, of course, in the other direction?
I think... Sorry, Shoshana, did you want to...
Sorry, I was pointing at you because I thought you were about to say something.
Well, I was. Is that okay?
I'll go after you.
No, I'm thinking about that, and I'm also thinking about how both of you were talking about universal values. And it's made me think I should just throw in a little bit of historical reality here, that the Jewish community didn't have an opportunity to do public good until about 250 years ago. Jews were seen as the outsider. There were only certain kinds of roles they were allowed to have in European society, but also in Islamic societies. And so it's only with modernity that it's even become possible for Jews to think about doing something for non-Jews. This is quite a new thing. They weren't allowed into guilds. They weren't allowed to own land. So for the most part, Jews had to live in isolated communities and perhaps were utilized in certain ways by the powers that be. So for that reason, I think we got very good at setting up our own internal systems because nobody else was going to look after the various villages. And it was when modernity hit that the Jewish community started to build some of these structures and embrace them wholeheartedly. Yeah. Not everyone. There are certain sects within Judaism that have completely rejected that and continue to function the way and continue to dress the way they did in 18th century Poland. But for the most part, the modern parts of the Jewish community, all of this came at the same time, right? The ability to go to university, to embrace modernity, and to pull that in the tradition. So it's kind of grown organically for our community with modernity. We embrace, some of the best practices that have happened, within philanthropy, and there really isn't a sense of conflict there.
Okay. Just before Jim answers, when this round of responses has concluded, I'm going to start asking you to think about your perfectly honed and extremely short question for these very distinguished people. Jim.
I think the Christian tradition is concerned about the exercise of power, and it finds extreme wealth problematic. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And if we're asking about a kind of shift in philanthropic culture and more sort of secular direction, for me, the issue is the question of whether financial giving is a renunciation that is good for the soul and good for you and also happens to be good for others. Or is it an exercise of power to determine some outcome for other people that you have decided? And I think for me that is where I certainly want the Christian and I think other religious perspectives to just raise some questions about philanthropy as it's practiced today.
Okay, that's an interesting note for this to hang on. I might come back to that. Right, you
could I say something?
Okay,
Very quickly.
Iqbal and then the person over there.
No, I was just going to say that, because what I understood from the question was what can we learn from this, and what can we give to the other side? Definitely, one of the things that we observe or think about a lot at the National Zakat Foundation is the fact that Muslims are reported in this country to be amongst the most generous sort of giving group in the entire country. And that's because we believe so fervently in this idea of reward in the hereafter, even though socioeconomically we're actually the poorest group in this country. And the problem with that is that we're also very, therefore, gullible donors. It doesn't matter where it goes or what happens or the impact. The worldly impact becomes almost secondary to the fact that I've given, my reward is with God. So actually, particularly how the money was spent or whatever. So that definitely, and I think that's a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding to say, well, actually, God doesn't care for effectiveness here. In fact, there's an idea that the two should be correlated in a sense, in terms of collective outcomes. The more collectively effective we are in this life, or maybe there's more collective.
And is that reconcilable, that tension?
Oh, yeah, I think it's absolutely reconcilable. Yeah, I think it's absolutely reconcilable. I think we often find ourselves talking as Muslims about the middle way, the idea of balance. In fact, in the Quran calls us the middle nation, always trying to balance, if you like, the letter and the spirit of the law and everything that we're doing. Balancing purposefulness and the idea of right intention, and avoiding kind of ostentation in giving with, and avoiding other alternative, these sort of negative intentions, if you like, other purposes. Balancing that with then the actual effectiveness, the impact, the sort of the real world of it, if you like.
Okay. I can't resist. Sorry, just because I can't resist picking up on the hint that you gave in your last answer. Is your anxiety a kind of arrogance of social engineering, or is your anxiety something to do with the ego returns to charity, or have I misunderstood which thing you are sceptical about?
I think it's both. I'm concerned that philanthropists, I'm concerned for their souls, that they're not thinking about philanthropy in the right way, and I'm concerned about the power that they're able to exercise and how they're accountable for it.
Okay, so that is both. Right. Very kind stewards in red T-shirts have microphones. If you put your hand up, they will identify you. And
thank you very much. I just wonder if we shouldn't, or invite the panel, to explore a little bit more about what we mean by philanthropy. It seems to me that we've been talking quite a lot, and the common parlance is about philanthropy is about either giving money, time, talents, or whatever. But and exercise of power, I agree with that one. But all of that is about patching up a world that's gone wrong. If we're really talking, and we are people of the faith here, we believe that this is God's world, and we're put here to steward it, ought we to be going back a stage about how this world is ordered and our role in that, so that we don't have to spend all our time patching up what's been done wrong? Thank you.
that's a very big question. Who wants to take that, Shoshana?
No, we actually talk about that a lot at the foundation. We talk about it, our shorthand is upstream and downstream, right? In terms of, when you have people who are hungry, we support Trussell Trust because they feed people who are hungry at that very moment. But then you have to go back a few steps and think, well, how did we get to this place? And why is there hunger? And what are some of the more upstream things? So does everybody understand what I mean by upstream and downstream? If there's dirty water, right, you can purify the water and then drink it. Or you can go back upstream and figure out what is causing the water to be dirty at that level, and let's get rid of that cause. And so we actually consciously do both. We know that the upstream is far more strategic, and in the long run, it will prevent the dirty water. But when somebody's on your doorstep and they're hungry, you also have to feed them. And so we struggle with that every single day, and there's really not a day that goes by in my work that we don't kind of go, I know we really need to focus on the upstream on this one, but meanwhile, we need to help these people. So I think it's a fantastic question and should always, always be at the forefront of what we do.
Gordon.
Thank you. I was hoping you could give some historical context. And what I mean by that is you've espoused some traditions that are at least 500 or 2,000 or even older. If you look at where we are today, if you can offer maybe some historical view of from those beginning periods when those traditions were first set down, how are we, or the believers in each of those traditions, are they broadly sticking to it, or have we seen a decline over time, such that, for example, tithing, is it now kind of averaging 2%? Or, how have your respective religions looked at that since these initial concepts were brought out?
Okay. Big question. I'll focus specifically on my understanding of the practice of zakat anyway. It seems as though within even half a century to a century after the death of the Prophet, that it was kind of started to be undone, basically, in terms of it being a centralized kind of function. That might be because the Muslim world grew very fast, became extremely wealthy, and there were all sorts of forms of other kind of wealth. And so oftentimes zakat was left to then people to just sort out on a localized basis. And certainly where we are if we look at where we are today, there are very, very few, even Muslim majority countries, Muslim governments who make it a mandatory thing to do, even which I find really odd, because I think that actually they probably wouldn't face much resistance. I mean, they all have forms of taxation. Malaysia is a good example of where they have kind of tax rebates if you give zakat, right? So it kind of encourages you to give zakat, and then you take it off your normal, other forms of taxation. It seems to be an obvious source of resources for a lot of countries in a lot of difficult kind of situations. Certainly now in Muslim minority communities, as we observed nowadays in various places in the West, quote unquote, it's kind of transitioning now. Anyway, we're trying to transition it from a just complete personal private act of charity to a more organized kind of system.
I'll say something. Have things deteriorated? Well, in the second chapter of the book of Acts, we're told that the first Christians held everything in common. And then in the subsequent chapters of Acts, it all unravels. So things have deteriorated quite early on. As Stefan said, I'm sort of representing 2 billion Christians, and that's an impossible task. But what I would say about my own tradition is I think there has been a loss of certain disciplines of giving. And as I say, tithing isn't necessarily the sort of universal standard for Christians, but the Church of England still teaches that people should give 5% of their net income to the church and another 5% to other charitable causes. So there is a 10% tithe in a sense. And I preach that to people, and I try and practice that. But the reality is most people in the pews I'm preaching to probably don't. And I think part of the challenge for us is that people have started to think about their giving, their Christian giving, as just, and they're giving to the church as one among many charitable options that they might consider with Save the Children and the World Wildlife Fund or whatever. And so we've lost a certain discipline, I think, about it.
And I'm guessing that there is a very complex historical interaction with entirely secular forms of tithing, let's call it taxation, or the relative role of the state as opposed to private actors. So as one increases, others may well, I mean, I don't know this historical interaction, but you have to be sure that it exists, and it's complex and will differ in different parts of the world depending on the extent of formal economies and so on.
Well, and I'll just extend that it depends on the economy within which you're working in the time period, whether it's modern. It also depends on the kind of society. So tithing works well when you're in an agricultural society, because you're bringing in the crops and you're giving a certain percentage of those to the priests. So that was a certain kind of taxation that works in an agricultural society when you're farming and when you have animal husbandry going on. No surprise that it ends when, at least for the Jewish community, when the temple is destroyed and Jews are dispersed around the world and they no longer hold land, right? So that's when tzedakah comes in almost as a replacement for that, taking the values of it and translating it into another operating system, so to speak. I think what's interesting now in the modern world where you're not living in closed communities is we do have some percentages certainly in terms of Jewish charitable giving of in the UK at least, 25% of the Jewish community only give to secular causes. Now that's a shift, right? And I would say that, and we can, if we map those who's doing that, those tend to be the more assimilated people. So the value of giving is still there, but where they're giving is very different. And I think a lot of this is contextual, because one of the things we know about why people give is that it has to do with peers in many ways. It has to do with the home that you were grown up in and the values that your home had, but it also has to do with what are the people around you doing? And if the people around you are giving to the opera, then you're going to end up giving to the opera. If the people around you are giving and sending money overseas, we haven't even talked about that, sending money overseas, then you'll tend to do that. So I just think the context, the social context of this is fascinating.
Completely. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, many of you in the room will be familiar with the effective altruism movement, and that is based on a radically secular version of tithing, derived very explicitly from that non-secular system.
I'll just add one other thing to the context, which is, I'm from the States originally, and the tax setup in the States, it is so advantageous to set up your own foundation in the States, right? And so we saw this burst of family foundations in the USA. That's not because of any great burst in altruism, right? That was a nice little nudge from the US government, right, that I think ended up doing some good stuff. Here, the legal structures are very different, and so you don't see as many family foundations. I don't think that's because Brits are any less generous. It has to do with the kinds of structures, again, the context.
Yes.
I'm going to try and articulate this the best I can, but the way I'm understanding sort of faith is in the context that good is an output as opposed to an input. So for instance, I'm a Muslim, and I also give Zakat and pray, but I don't necessarily do that because I think I'm a good person. It's just sort of mandatory for me to do, otherwise I may go to hell. So I look at it in the sense that my intent is not to particularly help anyone, but sort of not to go to hell or face kind of the punishments from not doing sort of the requirements and the obligatory things that I'm meant to do. So how do you guys sort of reconcile it? Or is there any way to sort of quantify intent? Am I sort of, for instance, in the Islamic sense, am I doing the correct thing by sort of praying, not necessarily to make myself a better person, but just as a result of this is something that I have to do, given that I'm part of this faith?
Well, God is not a tyrant, and so the idea is not to do things purely ritualistically or with a sort of legalist kind of approach. Those are the rules. I follow them mindlessly. In fact, there is a lot of, there is a huge, even in the Quran, there is a lot that is said to absolutely discourage that approach. So the prayer that is done mindlessly is akin to hypocrisy, according to the Quran, right? So actually, if you want to avoid punishment, then better to go the other way around, actually, to look at it as a more meaningful, real, purposeful engagement or interaction, as opposed to, well, those are the rules, I'll just do it. It's as if it's not like just sort of passing an exam when you have no interaction with the exam and I just put the right things down. If I do it, then everything will be fine. That is that is very typical of the approach of many Muslims, I find, but it is hugely kind of problematic. So I think that there is something about, I think as I referred earlier in a different context, to a balance between, if you like, the letter and the spirit of the law in all things. So we pray, we hold fast onto the fact, and Islam is remarkable in the fact that it has kept a lot of these things, like no Muslim disputes that, well, the vast majority at least agree that prayer 5 times a day is absolutely part of what it means to be Muslim. That is held. So we're not disputing that. We don't dispute the movements or the actions or the core tenets of prayer. That's the frame. That's the kind of legal framework. But then within that, we need to give that substance. Otherwise, it's just a hollow box, hollow shell. Zakat is a little bit different, I would say, because it's a little like just think about it as taxation. Does the government care with which intention you give your taxes? No, as long as they're recovering those taxes, right? So there's a twofold thing. Zakat is a little bit different in the sense that it has a very clear social kind of function, and therefore, but if that's going to be administered by others, whether you're giving zakat mindlessly, quote unquote, to a charity or to whoever, they're doing good with it. Okay, fine, that's done. But certainly there is, as we mentioned earlier, a correlation between what you'll find as in relation to that in the hereafter, which is correlated to your intention with that particular thing. So you may have technically fulfilled the duty as a bare minimum, but there are 99 other levels to aspire to, I suppose.
And similarly, there's one of the greatest medieval rabbis, Maimonides. He came up with it's a hierarchy of how one gives tzedakah. Yeah, so you have to fulfill the obligation to give tzedakah. You don't have a choice about that. But there's giving tzedakah and there's giving tzedakah. And he has 8 different levels to it. And for instance, the lowest level is you give it grudgingly. You give it and you want credit for it. All those kinds of things. As you work your way up, you start to give anonymously. You start to give with goodwill. The highest level, the second highest level is giving completely anonymously, where the giver doesn't know the recipient doesn't know the giver. But the highest level, interestingly, sort of transcends all of these things of, do you give with good intention and good grace? Do you give knowing who the recipient or the giver is? The highest one is inviting someone who is in need to go into partnership with you in a business. Right? Which tells you that actually what's going on with those layers has to do with dignity. And preserving one's own dignity, sort of educating oneself to give with good grace, is about becoming a better person and shaping your own soul in some way, but it's also preserving the dignity of the person who is on the receiving end. And interestingly, this is just one of those quirky things about Judaism. We are so hazy about the afterworld. We don't know very much about it. We kind of think it's probably there, but there's, Jews write a lot. We have lots and lots and lots of commentary and writing, and this much is about the afterlife. So interestingly, the giving tradition comes from a desire to perfect this world, and an obligation that somehow it goes back to what you were saying. We are stewards over this world, and this world is not a stepping stone to the next. This world is a gift, and we have an obligation to make this world environmentally, socially, spiritually whole, which is the word shalom, means whole.
It's interesting you mentioned Maimonides. I, in the course of my work, I often ask corporations who give whether their donations would go up or down if it were mandatory that it be anonymous. And they say, what do you mean up or down? We'd just stop. I draw no inference, I just report.
Well, as opposed to, one of the big debates we have at Pears Foundation is we often don't put actually we've done it more and more now, but at the beginning when the foundation started, our trustees did not want the logo on anything that we were giving to, because they felt that was contrary to Jewish values. And over time, what happened was the grantees who were receiving the money said, can we please put your logo on, because it tells other people that you believe in us. And it actually helps us to raise more money as a result of doing that. And the trustees had a bit of a crisis of faith over that and said, are we doing the right thing by giving anonymously? Actually, we probably should put our kite mark on things, because it tells other people that we've done our due diligence, we think this is a good charity, and they can come to us if they have any questions about it. And now we actually do that, but with some hesitation that we don't want people to think we're only doing this to put our name on the building.
Well, the other obvious point to make is that donors crowd in other donors. Okay, so the principle of anonymity is very, very complicated. Because if people see you give, they might then choose to give. And if they didn't know, anyway, you get the idea. There is a question in the front row, I think. This front row and then that front row.
So I'm thinking, as you speak about this issue again about motivation, and it occurs to me that this conversation is about faith potentiating philanthropy. Philanthropy also potentiates faith. And I'm thinking about all of the major donors and some of the wealthiest people in the world who talk about their giving quite openly, and they write books about it. But I must say, I don't hear them talk about faith as an impetus. Am I missing something? Or do you, I'm sure you have anecdotes, but some of our greatest leaders in the world of philanthropy, and by that I mean people who give the most, are not talking about a faith as an impetus. My guess is it's there, and maybe this is just a testimony to our times. But what are your thoughts about the fact that the motivations that people are expressing about why they're giving these transformative gifts don't have the elegance or power of faith that you're inviting us to consider?
I think perhaps this is a slightly broader question about faith and public discourse. I think a lot of people don't talk about their faith in the public sphere because people think, they think people will think they're crazy. It's certainly in this country a little bit less in America, but I think it's still present. It's just not something that people do very much. I certainly read that 55% of Americans say that religion is a primary motivating force in their philanthropy. So it is there, and I suspect that might be the reason why people don't talk about it. Or perhaps a concern that you invite judgment if you say, I'm giving this money and that makes me a good Christian or whatever it is, and that hypocrisy is so sort of, such a hot topic in public life now. Perhaps there's that concern as well.
The corollary, of course, is how much money is given to religious causes rather than from or by. Sorry.
Well, no, I'll just give an anecdote on that. I mean, like I said, I do sometimes go to Rwanda, go to Ghana, and I'm quite obvious when I'm in those places, and there's various aid workers sort of floating around, and people will sometimes come up to me and they'll just whisper, and they'll kind of go, "I'm Jewish too," and I say to them, but does anybody here know that? Do you share that? Because is that part of the reason that you're here? And they'll have a conversation with me about it. And they'll say, "Oh yeah, I grew up in a home and we were taught that we had to go out and change the world and this was, and do something." But they won't share it. And I try to have a conversation with them and say, I think it's not only okay, but important to share who you are with the people who are around, and I often do it when I'm out there, and the response is tremendous, because even if people have never met a Jew before, which is quite common, they understand that we share something. They understand that, because a lot of the people that I do encounter are people of faith, and so then they understand why I'm doing this. Right? They can't understand it otherwise. Why has this white person from who knows where come in here and helped us do this kind of thing? What do they want? And when I say, this is something that my faith impels me to do, they go, "Oh, yep, okay, got that." Right? So I think it's actually quite important for people to do this. But you're right. I think the shift towards a secular society, and a sense that if I say that I'm doing this from a place of faith, people are going to think I'm a nutter. Right? And some sort of fanatic, and they'll be suspicious of me, and they won't treat me as if I'm an intelligent, educated person. I think there's that fear.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi. My question takes this topic a little bit further, and especially in relation to international development situations. So you have faith that allows you to, let's say, give, but then taking all of that money, how do you decide that what you're giving to, or deciding on how this money is being spent on certain communities, is what the community needs itself, versus what you think the community needs? And then in further going into international development context, how is this in relation to incentivizing governments to provide those services themselves versus having philanthropies come in and provide that funding from a philanthropic point of view?
I mean, those are both questions that are fundamental to doing good development. And I wouldn't say I have the answers. I would say that we struggle with those questions constantly. We never go in and tell a community what we think they should have. I mean, that's just, it's bad development and it's bad human being. Like, I mean, you listen to people. You listen to them. You listen to what they need. You try and do no harm, which is much harder than it sounds. So we work with local partners, local charities, and we are quite conscious that it's very possible that if we go in and don't listen to what's going on there, we'll actually do more harm than good. And in terms of not stepping in where government should be, absolutely. One of the things that we will sometimes do are the things that government can't do. So we can do things like convene. Sometimes you need a little bit of extra resource to convene all of the players, get them all together in one place so that they can then make some decisions, policy decisions. So we'll do convening. We will sometimes do a piece of research that we think government would be able, if they had this research, they would be able to make better policy decisions. And sometimes we will pilot something with the express agreement with government, not just in the developing world, we do this in the UK as well, that we will pilot this in the understanding that if it works, right, we'll take the risk. If it works, though, you will incorporate it over time. So those are some of the mechanisms that we use to try and get around those very, very real dangers of philanthropy, well-meaning philanthropy, doing more harm than good.
I'm going to suggest we have one last question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to give us a concluding sentence.
Oh, sorry. Hi. So this might be obvious, but are private religious charities and religious organizations, are they regulated differently from secular sort of charitable organizations, secular private foundations? How do you account to your congregations, or if I'm sitting in a church or in a synagogue or in a mosque giving money, how do I know where that's going as opposed to giving to sort of a private foundation or being part of a private foundation? Just generally that sort of structure of oversight, does that work differently than in the private sector?
Who wants to go first?
I was just going to say, well, mosques, for example, charities and mosques here, Muslim charities and mosques will just register as charities along with everyone else.
Yep. And churches.
I think Muslims have a kind of maybe a heightened fear that their charities are more under the spotlight or maybe more subject to sort of unfair sort of treatment perhaps or skepticism from maybe the charity commission or whoever. But as far as the rules are, as far as there's no separate kind of regulatory structures within the community, if you like. And as I said earlier, in sometimes I don't think we actually hold our charities sufficiently to account because we think, I've done my bit and whatever happens, happens.
I'll just add to that in the Jewish community, we have to, any charity has to fulfill the Charity Commission's criteria. We then often put on an extra layer. So for instance, in Jewish schools, they all have Ofsted inspections as they should. But Ofsted is not really qualified to judge the quality of the Jewish education that's being provided by the school, which is paid for privately. And so we have a organization called Pikuach that then goes in and inspects the schools and looks at their Jewish education to make sure that any of the money that the Jewish community is giving to these schools to support the Jewish education is teaching the kinds of British values that we think they should be taught. And sometimes when a school doesn't pass their Pikuach inspection, the Charity Commission doesn't know about it, but we say we don't think your Jewish education is up to speed, and there's a lot of, and we will support you to help develop a curriculum that also teaches X, Y, and Z. So if anything, there's a higher bar that we put onto it because we don't think the Charity Commission has the resources or the ability, nor should the Charity Commission be sort of thinking about what a good Jew looks like. It's our obligation to make sure that our children are being educated.
So similar, most churches and Christian organisations would be registered with the Charities Commission, and then we have similar sorts of things, for example, for church schools in terms of church inspectorates to provide extra oversight of that kind of thing.
Okay, to conclude, I would like each of you to suggest something. It can be a word, it can be a sentence, it can be an exhortation that the rest of us should learn from your tradition. What should we learn, all of us, from Islam? What should we learn from Judaism? What should we learn from Christianity? And I'm going to go far left, I think.
Well, thank you.
And finish with the far right.
You're still on my left, it's okay.
Oh, okay. Centre left.
Shoshana made correct observations about the word faith, and I think probably faith is perhaps most integral to my tradition. And another word for faith is trust. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about and a lot of what philanthropy is caught up with is systems of trust. Who do you trust to give your money to? Who's going to deliver? Whose money do you trust? Who do you trust enough to take money from? And I think it's an exploration of trust in the processes of philanthropy would be fruitful, and I would suggest perhaps Christianity has some resources.
I'm going to share one of the laws of tzedakah, which I absolutely love, and that is that even if one is the recipient of tzedakah, so I'm living in poverty, and therefore I need to receive this charitable giving, this tzedakah, I still have an obligation out of that money that I receive to give tzedakah. Now, it sounds really counterintuitive, right? If I need the money, why should I be giving money away? And it goes back to that concept of dignity, that it's, and you said it before, there's the material needs, and yes, I need to put supper on the table, but this idea that we all have a spiritual need to be able to give to someone who is worse off than us. And so, that sense of, and my poor children, I do it with them. I mean, they get a pittance in terms of their allowance, and part of that needs to go to tzedakah. Even though they say to me, but I don't have enough you have more than somebody else. And that idea that philanthropy is not for rich people. Philanthropy is something that all of us do, or all of us can do, even those of us who are in receipt of those funds.
So two things. One is from a, if you like, public policy perspective, and the other one from a personal, maybe a personal practice. So from a public policy perspective, I think that there's a lot of support from within, from the principles underpinning the Zakat tradition for the idea of increased wealth taxation in general, which is a topical kind of idea as a much better redistributive tool than simply purely forms of income tax. So let's all get behind a global wealth tax. That's number one. And the idea of a universal basic income, which again is becoming a more kind of topical kind of idea. The idea underpinning the Zakat notion is that no one in that community should be going below a certain level, and clearly that's not the case in the world at the moment. And so those two things from that perspective. I think on a personal basis, I think at a time when it feels as though there's an increasing amount of often, I don't know, I feel it. I think I certainly felt it when I was at this LSE event yesterday about the future, sort of dystopian sort of futures and all the rest of it. It feels as though, apathy can set in. A bit of hopelessness can set in. What's the point? Just to kind of we undermine. Maybe we can undermine in our own selves. We've probably all done this. We've passed by an opportunity to do something, but we haven't done it because what's the point? Probably won't make a difference. I think just don't underestimate the difference that even the smallest thing can make, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, even in this life, right? The smallest of actions can have a very significant transformational effect. So seize those opportunities, I suppose, whenever they pass by.
Okay. Thank you. So we've come to the end. I only have to do about 3 things, I think. I'm not going to try to summarize what we've discussed, but I'm going to pick out 2 or 3 things that particularly resonated. I was very struck by at least 2 of the 3 panelists going to this notion that giving isn't elective, it's foundational. In other words, it's not something you choose to do, it's something that you do because of your identity. I was very struck by the notion that language really matters, both within and between these traditions, and then within and between us and those traditions. I was absolutely captivated with the notion of capitalism for 6 years and socialism for one, as it were, one fallow year every 7 years. And I think the thing that has given me most pleasure this evening was the notion that smiling is an act of, in our language, an act of philanthropy. So clearly I'm going to attempt, when I cycle through Russia, to smile more. I want to thank my colleagues for helping us do this. I want to thank the stewards in red t-shirts for supporting us. I want to thank, of course, this very distinguished panel for stimulating, I think, really very interesting and very generous thinking around this question. And I want to thank you not only for being here, but for asking smart questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.